In the Sumerian Kings list, we are told that before the time of the flood, there were 5 sacred cities that were established, including Eridu. Kingship was first lowered from heaven to earth before the time of the flood. Then the flood came and swept over the earth, and kingship was then reestablished. What we're finding now with these new discoveries is that we have further evidence of an earlier habitation at these places. And what we're going to be finding is that this is ultimately affirming that these flood stories are true. And so this opens up a wide degree of latitude for alternative historians to say, hey, we've been saying for a long time that our timeline of the flood goes back to 12,000 BC, and that humans were in fact inhabiting these areas. And now we're discovering the connective tissue and evidence that supports those contentions.
How old is the human species in the Fertile Crescent? The scholar Berosus said that the Babylonian king lists go back 432,000 years. If that's true, then this area where you had Sumer, Babylon, was inhabited by civilized human beings hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Fertile Crescent was the name given to this region based on the 2 rivers known as the Tigris and Euphrates that flowed down from the north into the Persian Gulf and created a very fertile environment for civilizations such as the Sumerian and then Akkadian, Babylonian, and eventually Assyrian. According to the Uruk list of kings and sages, Eridu was the first city created on the banks of the Euphrates River. The tablet describes how this majestic city used its power and influence to create the Sumerian civilization that would encompass almost the entire Fertile Crescent, stretching from northern Iraq all the way to the Persian Gulf. And it would give rise to the pre-Diluvian cities Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak.
In the main temple complex at Eridu, known as the Ziggurat of Eridu, we see that the top of that temple complex, that's been eroded for thousands of years, contains thousands of seashells covering the top of that temple, proving that that had to have been deposited during the great floods of the Younger Dryas.
If the record of the King's List from the time of the Great Flood forward is precisely accurate, can be verified through history and geology, then it's possible that these kings actually began the ruling when they came to Earth, that they began ruling during the Pleistocene, during the Ice Age, during the warming times and the cooling times, that go all the way up to and include even the Younger Dryas, and that the Dryas would be the reason that the flood happened at the time that it happened. It may be that through this Sumerian Kings List, we have the most accurate and the most precise dating mechanism known to exist, giving us insight into ancient history, ancient civilization, and the origins of the human species that extend back farther and clearer than anything else that we've seen to this point.
Mainstream science describes this influential Sumerian civilization as arising around 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. The theory is that this society arose from primitive hunter-gatherer beginnings into an agricultural society. But when we turn our attention to the ancient tablets, as well as the new sites being uncovered in Iraq, they tell an incredible story about gods that arrived on Earth to start humanity. Historians and researchers that have closely studied this ancient culture believe that a race of beings called the Anunnaki, or Anunna in these texts, may have arrived on Earth many thousands of years ago.
So who exactly are the Anunnaki? Well, the name itself is Babylonian, and it means the people or gods of the sky and the earth. But this was not the original term that was used by the much earlier Sumerians. They called these same mythical beings the Anunna, and this means the people of the sky. And some people might want to interpret this as meaning aliens or people that come down from the sky.
Was the Fertile Crescent one of the areas in which humans were manifested in the beginning? It certainly would appear so according to the Sumerian texts, which say that after a great devastation, the gods came and manifested humans again. And this is a theme that we see repeated many times in many cultures all over the world, but certainly it's there in the Middle East, that there was a creation of humans, there was a massive flood, and the earth was repopulated.
Countless myths and legends tell of a time where the gods ruled the earth. But the stories become muddy when researchers try to understand the genetic leap from Homo sapien to Homo sapien sapien.
From the research that I've been looking at in Mesopotamia and Sumeria and also comparative cultures in Egypt and South America, they talk about a time of experimentation, and it seems to be the suggestion that they were experimenting with DNA to see if there was some way where they could compromise their DNA with humans. And at some point they succeeded, because over in Egypt, which is not too far from Mesopotamia, they talk about a time when there was a bloodline of half human, half divine people. So obviously they succeeded because these people were on the throne of Egypt. And we know they succeeded because they also talk about a time in 3100 BC, and I quote, when the first pharaoh of a purely human bloodline takes the throne of Egypt. Now, you're not going to mention that unless before that, the time preceding this period, there was a period of half human, half divine people, which is the gap in between the time when the creator gods were also in charge of the different thrones around the world. So they must have found a way to genetically compromise their DNA with humans, which then, of course, gives birth to people who are very tall. Well, they become normal people that we see around today.
For the humans, any species that came from the skies were called in Middle East Anunnaki, that were the people that came from the stars to earth, from the heavens to earth. That's what means Anunnaki. So anyone who came from the stars, from the skies, would be that. But mainly those who settled in Middle East, in the territory of Iran, Iraq, those territories, were the ones that got in touch the most with humans and modified them as we know humanity today. So they kind of were the fathers and the mothers of our civilizations or our species as we know it today.
As archaeologists continue to discover throughout the Fertile Crescent, the sophistication of these pre-Diluvian cultures appears to have been happening at a very accelerated rate. The evidence uncovers the path from primitive living to high society had massive influence from a highly advanced culture.
It's so important to understand how the ancient land of Sumer was built under the rule and guide of the Anunnaki, because when you look at the ancient tablets, you discover that all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this modern civilization just appeared. We're talking about paved roads, sewer systems, water treatment plants. They even had bicameral Congress, schools. All this comes from these ancient people. What's interesting about the Sumerian Kings list, as you get closer to the newer age of the tablet, where the newer writing is located, you begin to see where mankind is now being given some kingship. In other words, where it starts with Gilgamesh, actually, all of a sudden you see a half human, then half Anunnaki being who's now been given kingship. And then after him, precedingly, more and more offspring who are just human with a smaller percentage of this Anunnaki bloodline are now also given kingship. So we start to see this line where it breaks off from these beings, these advanced gods, or these Naturu, as they call them in ancient times, and begins to be mankind actually ruling themselves with a king as a liaison to these advanced alien beings.
If these Anunna or Anunnaki were guiding the expansion of the Homo sapien sapien from the Fertile Crescent region, how did they guide us? Was it with brute force, as some scholars claim? Or was this guidance passed down to only a select few, in sacred ceremony, as it is commonly depicted in ancient Sumerian art?